There comes a moment in life when you realize that constantly pursuing someone who keeps stepping away is costing you something far greater than the relationship itself. It is costing you your peace. It is costing you your confidence. It is costing you your connection with the most important person you will ever know, yourself. Many people believe that if they love harder, give more, sacrifice more, explain more, and wait longer, eventually they will receive the love they deserve. But life operates according to a deeper principle. What you chase often runs. What you desperately cling to often slips away. And what you finally release begins to reveal its true value. The avoidant individual often lives behind invisible walls. These walls are not built from strength. They are built from fear. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of dependence. Fear of rejection. Fear of losing control. They convince themselves that distance equals safety. They learn to survive by keeping emotions at arm's length. As long as you continue chasing them, a hidden pattern remains intact. They know you are there. They know another message will come. They know another chance will be offered. They know another door will remain open. Your presence becomes predictable. And what is predictable is often undervalued. But everything changes the moment you stop caring. Not because you are playing a game, not because you are seeking revenge, not because you are playing a game. You stop caring because you finally understand a truth that transforms lives. And your worth does not depend on someone's ability to recognize it. The moment you reclaim your attention, something extraordinary happens. The energy that was flowing outward begins flowing inward. The emotional investment that was feeding someone else's uncertainty, begins feeding your own growth. You start sleeping better. You start thinking clearer. You start pursuing goals again. You start rediscovering passions that were buried beneath anxiety and overthinking. And while you are rebuilding yourself, something else is happening. The avoidant notices the silence. At first, they may ignore it. Then they become curious. Then they become uncomfortable. Because for the first time, they are forced to confront something they have spent years avoiding. The reality of loss. Many people think avoidants do not feel deeply. The truth is often the opposite. They feel deeply but struggle to process those feelings in healthy ways. When you stop pursuing them, they lose the distraction that allowed them to avoid confronting their emotions. The silence becomes loud. The absence becomes noticeable. The space where your attention once existed becomes impossible to ignore. Suddenly there are no reassuring messages, no emotional safety net, no constant reminders that someone is waiting. And in that space, questions begin to emerge. What happened? Why aren't they reaching out? Have I lost them? Will they come back? Those questions create emotional tension, and emotional tension creates awareness. For perhaps the first time, they begin seeing your value not through your presence, but through your absence. That is one of life's greatest paradoxes. People often understand the value of water after experiencing thirst. They understand the value of health after experiencing illness. They understand the value of love after experiencing loss. Your absence becomes a mirror, and mirrors reveal truths. The avoidant begins remembering the conversations they dismissed, the moments they took for granted, the support they overlooked, the loyalty they assumed would always remain available. Memories that once seemed ordinary now carry emotional weight. What they once viewed as guaranteed now appears precious. But this is where your greatest lesson emerges. Your purpose is not to wait for someone else's awakening. Your purpose is not to pause your life until someone finally recognizes your worth. Your purpose is growth. Your purpose is expansion. Your purpose is becoming the strongest, wisest, most fulfilled version of yourself. Because real power is not found in making someone miss you. Real power is found in no longer needing them to. Think about that. The highest level of freedom is not getting the call. It is being completely at peace whether the call comes or not. That is emotional mastery. That is inner strength. That is personal transformation. When you stop caring in the unhealthy sense, you do not become cold. You become free. You stop measuring your value through another person's behavior. You stop allowing inconsistency to define your emotional state. You stop handing over the keys to your happiness. And once you do that, your life begins to change. You walk differently. You speak differently. You make decisions differently. Your confidence no longer depends on external approval. It comes from an internal certainty, a certainty that says, I am enough, a certainty that says, I deserve mutual effort, a certainty that says, I will not abandon myself while trying to keep someone else. The avoidance emotional downfall often begins when they realize the person they assumed that would always be available has chosen themselves. Not chosen someone else. Chosen themselves. And that realization can be profoundly unsettling, because your departure forces a confrontation with consequences. Every decision creates an outcome. Every withdrawal creates a distance. Every missed opportunity creates a possibility that may never return. But while they are confronting those realities, you must remain focused on your own evolution. Do not look backward with bitterness. Do not look backward with resentment. Look forward with purpose. Life rewards those who respect themselves enough to walk away from what continually diminishes them. And when you do, something beautiful happens. You stop operating from scarcity. You stop believing that this one person determines your future. You begin seeing abundance everywhere. New opportunities, new relationships, new experiences, new levels of growth. You discover that what you thought was the end was actually a beginning of self-respect, a beginning of emotional freedom, a beginning of genuine confidence. Remember this, the greatest victory is not that someone finally realizes your value after losing you. The greatest victory is that you realized your value before losing yourself. The moment you stop chasing validation, you start attracting respect. The moment you stop begging for attention, you start commanding presence. The moment you stop seeking permission to be worthy, you become unstoppable. Stand tall, protect your peace, honor your value, invest in your growth, and trust that what is meant for your life will never require you to abandon yourself to keep it. Because the strongest position you can ever occupy is not being desperately wanted by someone else. It is being deeply connected to your own purpose, your own worth, and your own unshakable belief that the best chapters of your life are still ahead of you. There is a powerful shift that occurs when a person finally stops investing their emotional energy into someone who has continually kept them at a distance. For a long time, they may have believed that the answer was to try harder, love deeper, become more understanding, or prove their worth more consistently. They convinced themselves that if they could just say the right words, show enough patience, or remain available long enough, the other person would eventually open their heart and fully commit. But the reality is that constantly chasing someone often creates an unhealthy emotional imbalance. One person becomes the pursuer, while the other becomes the distancer. One person is investing energy, attention, and emotional resources, while the other grows, accustomed to receiving those things without having to fully reciprocate. Over time, this dynamic can leave the pursuer emotionally exhausted, confused, and disconnected from their own needs. The moment emotional detachment begins, everything changes. Emotional detachment is not hatred. It is not revenge. It is not becoming cold-hearted. It is the decision to stop allowing another person's behavior to dictate your emotional state. It is the realization that your peace matters. It is understanding that your value does not increase or decrease based on someone else's ability to appreciate you. For many people, this shift happens after months or even years of disappointment. They wake up one day and realize they are tired of overthinking every message, analyzing every interaction, and waiting for signs that may never come. They recognize that they have spent so much time trying to earn love that they have neglected their own growth, happiness, and self-respect. When they finally stop chasing, something remarkable happens. The emotional energy that was flowing outward begins flowing inward. Instead of focusing on what the other person is doing, they begin focusing on what they need. Instead of asking, why don't they choose me? They begin asking, why haven't I been choosing myself? This question changes everything. Suddenly, their priorities shift. They start investing in their goals, their health, their relationships, and their future. They rediscover passions that were forgotten. They reconnect with dreams that had been postponed. They begin building a life that feels meaningful regardless of who stays or leaves. And this is where the psychology becomes fascinating. The avoidant individual often feels most comfortable when they believe they have complete control over emotional distance. As long as they know someone is available, waiting, and willing to pursue them, there is little pressure to confront their own emotions. The relationship remains predictable, but when the pursuit stops, predictability disappears. The silence becomes noticeable. The absence becomes real. The emotional support they once assumed would always be there is no longer guaranteed. For the first time, they may begin experiencing the consequences of emotional distance. Questions arise. Doubts emerge. Reflection begins. They start noticing what is missing rather than what is available. The very attention they once took for granted suddenly gains value because it is no longer freely accessible. This does not mean they immediately change. It does not mean they suddenly become emotionally available overnight. But it often creates an internal disruption that forces them to face feelings they previously avoided. Meanwhile, the person who detached emotionally experiences something even more valuable than validation. They experience freedom. Freedom from waiting. Freedom from uncertainty. Freedom from needing constant reassurance. Freedom from tying their self-worth to someone else's actions. This freedom becomes the foundation of true confidence. Not the confidence that comes from being chosen by another person, but the confidence that comes from choosing yourself. Because at the end of the day, the most powerful transformation is not when someone finally realizes your value. The most powerful transformation is when you realize it first and refuse to settle for anything less than the respect, effort, and love you genuinely deserve. One of the most misunderstood aspects of avoidant behavior is that it often appears as confidence, independence, or emotional strength. From the outside, it can seem as though the avoidant person simply does not care. They may appear calm when others are emotional. They may create distance when intimacy grows. They may withdraw precisely when the relationship seems to be moving toward a deeper connection. To many people, this behavior feels confusing and even contradictory. What is often hidden beneath the surface, however, is a deep desire for connection mixed with an equally deep fear of vulnerability. The avoidant individual may genuinely enjoy affection, companionship, and emotional closeness, but the moment those experiences begin to feel intense, something inside them becomes uncomfortable. Emotional intimacy can trigger fears they have spent years trying to escape. For this reason, avoidants often feel safest when someone is chasing them. As long as another person is making the effort, initiating conversations, expressing feelings, and maintaining the connection, the avoidant remains in a position of emotional control. They know the relationship is still available. They know the other person has not left. They know there is little risk of complete loss because someone else is carrying the emotional weight. This creates a comfort zone, not necessarily a healthy comfort zone, but a familiar one. The avoidant learns that they can step back whenever emotions become overwhelming, and often the other person will step forward to close the distance. They can delay difficult conversations, avoid vulnerability, or retreat into silence, because they trust that the relationship will still be there when they return. Over time, this pattern becomes predictable. The more one person pursues, the less urgency the avoidant feels to examine their own behavior. Why would they confront their fears if the relationship continues functioning despite their non-emotional withdrawal? Why would they challenge old habits if someone is constantly compensating for them? The cycle continues because it works, at least temporarily. But every cycle has a breaking point. Eventually, the person doing all the pursuing becomes exhausted. They grow tired of carrying the emotional responsibility for two people. They become weary of initiating every conversation, repairing every conflict, and fighting for a connection that feels increasingly one-sided. Then something unexpected happens. They stop chasing, not because they no longer care, not because they never loved, but because they finally recognize that love cannot thrive where effort exists only on one side. For the avoidant, this moment can be deeply unsettling. The emotional safety they relied upon suddenly disappears. The familiar pattern is broken. The person who always reached out is silent. The person who always waited is moving forward. The person who always made excuses is no longer available to absorb disappointment. This creates an emotional experience the avoidant often tries very hard to avoid: uncertainty. Now they do not know where they stand. Now they cannot predict the outcome. Now they must confront the possibility that the relationship may actually be ending. And that possibility often awakens emotions that were hidden beneath layers of avoidance. The absence of pursuit creates a vacuum. In that vacuum, reflection begins. They start remembering moments they overlooked. They replay conversations they dismissed. They notice the emotional support they once considered permanent. They begin to understand that what felt guaranteed was never guaranteed at all. This realization can feel uncomfortable because it challenges a belief many avoidants unconsciously hold, that people will always remain available, regardless of how much burial. Life eventually teaches a different lesson. Every relationship requires effort. Every connection requires presence. Every meaningful bond requires vulnerability. When someone continually receives understanding without offering the same in return, they may not recognize the value of what they have until it is gone. Meanwhile, the person who stopped chasing begins discovering a different truth. They realize that peace feels better than constant anxiety. They realize that self-respect feels stronger than emotional dependence. They realize that genuine love does not require endless pursuit. And that is why avoidants often feel safest while being chased. The chase protects them from confronting their fears. But when the chase ends, they are left face to face with the very emotions they have spent years running from. In many cases, that becomes the beginning of their greatest internal struggle, and, potentially, the beginning of their greatest personal growth. There is a moment that arrives unexpectedly in the life of an avoidant person, a moment that often changes everything. It is not a dramatic argument. It is not a final confrontation. It is not even a heartbreaking goodbye. More often than not, it arrives in complete silence. For weeks, months, or even years, they have grown accustomed to a certain emotional pattern. No matter how much distance they created, someone was always there. No matter how long they withdrew, a message would eventually arrive. No matter how cold or unavailable they became, another chance would be offered. The connection seemed permanent. The attention seemed endless. The affection seemed guaranteed. Then one day, it stops. No message. No call. No attempt to reconnect. No effort to close the distance. Just silence. At first, the avoidant may barely notice it. They may even welcome it. After all, space is something they have always valued. Distance has often felt safer than intimacy. Freedom has often felt more comfortable than emotional responsibility. In the beginning, the silence can feel like relief. There is no pressure, no emotional conversations, no expectations, no demands for vulnerability. Everything seems easier. But relief has a strange way of transforming when enough time passes. What initially feels comfortable slowly becomes noticeable. What is noticeable eventually becomes uncomfortable. What is uncomfortable eventually becomes impossible to ignore. The person who always occupied a space in their life is suddenly absent. And absence has power. It creates a void that cannot be filled by distraction alone. The avoidant may try to stay busy. They may immerse themselves in work, hobbies, entertainment, or social activities. They may convince themselves that nothing has changed. They may tell themselves that this is exactly what they wanted. Yet beneath the surface, something else begins to happen. Their mind starts revisiting memories. Moments they once overlooked suddenly return with surprising clarity. A supportive conversation, a thoughtful gesture, a shared laugh, a message that arrived exactly when they needed encouragement. The little things they once considered ordinary begin to feel significant. This is because human beings often understand value most clearly through contrast. When something is constantly available, it can become invisible. When it disappears, its importance becomes impossible to deny. The avoidant begins experiencing what psychologists often call delayed emotional processing. Feelings that were pushed aside during the relationship now have room to emerge. The emotions that once felt overwhelming are no longer competing with daily interaction. Without realizing it, they begin confronting emotions they spent years avoiding. Questions start appearing. Why haven't they reached out? Why do I keep thinking about them? What if they're moving on? What if I've lost them? What if they never come back? These questions create an emotional shock because they challenge an assumption the avoidant may have carried for a long time, that the connection would always remain available. Many avoidants unconsciously believe they can return whenever they are ready. They assume the door will remain open. They assume the person waiting will continue waiting. They assume that time changes nothing, but reality often tells a different story. People grow, people heal, people move forward. People eventually stop sacrificing themselves for relationships that fail to meet their need. And when the avoidant realizes this, a powerful emotional awakening can begin. For the first time, they are forced to experience the consequences of emotional distance. The relationship is no longer a certainty. The attention is no longer guaranteed. The affection is no longer freely accessible. This realization can trigger feelings of regret, not always because they lost the relationship itself, but because they begin seeing what they failed to appreciate while it was present. They recognize the consistency they once took for granted. They recognize the loyalty they once overlooked. They recognize the patience they once assumed would never run out. And perhaps most importantly, they recognize the value of someone who genuinely cared. Meanwhile, the person who stopped chasing is undergoing a completely different transformation. They are no longer trapped in uncertainty. They are no longer measuring their worth through someone else's actions. They are rebuilding their confidence, rediscovering their purpose, and creating a life that does not depend on external validation. That is what makes the silent shock so powerful. The avoidant expected distance. What they did not expect was permanence. They expected space. What they did not expect was absence. They expected another opportunity. What they did not expect was the possibility that the person who loved them would finally choose themselves. And sometimes, that realization becomes the loudest emotional wake-up call of all. The silence that once felt comfortable becomes a mirror, reflecting every missed opportunity, every unspoken feeling, and every chance they failed to embrace when it was still within reach. After the silence settles and the initial shock begins to fade, a deeper process often starts within the avoidant individual. This stage is far more significant than the moment they first notice your absence. The silence may capture their attention, but reflection is what truly changes them. Reflection forces them to sit with thoughts they have spent years outrunning. Reflection removes distractions. Reflection shines light into places they have carefully kept hidden. For a long time, emotional distance may have protected them from uncomfortable feelings. Whenever intimacy became overwhelming, they could pull away. Whenever vulnerability felt risky, they could create space. Whenever emotions intensified, they could focus on something else. Distance became their coping mechanism. But when the person who once pursued them stops caring, the familiar escape routes begin to disappear. There is no longer a constant source of reassurance. There is no longer someone continuously proving their love. There is no longer a guaranteed connection waiting patiently in the background. What remains is reality, and reality has a way of demanding attention. At first, the avoidant may try to justify everything. They may tell themselves that the relationship was not right. They may focus on flaws and imperfections. They may convince themselves that separation was inevitable. This is often the mind's attempt to protect itself from emotional discomfort. But over time, the protective stories become harder to maintain, because memories have a way of resurfacing, not just the painful moments, the meaningful ones, the genuine ones, the moments that carried emotional significance. Suddenly they remember the person who stood beside them during difficult times. They remember the conversations that brought comfort. They remember the support they received without having to ask for it. They remember the patience that was extended to them again and again. And as these memories return, something unexpected happens. The relationship begins to look different. What once seemed ordinary begins to appear extraordinary. What once felt guaranteed begins to appear rare. What once seemed replaceable begins to appear valuable. This is where regret often enters the picture. Regret is not simply sadness about losing someone. Regret is the painful awareness that a different choice could have produced a different outcome. It is the realization that opportunities existed but were not fully appreciated. It is understanding that love was available but not fully embraced. For the avoidant, this can be particularly difficult because regret forces them to confront the very thing they spent years avoiding: emotional responsibility. Instead of focusing on what the other person did wrong, they begin examining their own actions. Instead of asking why the relationship failed, they begin asking what role they played in its decline. Instead of seeing themselves as passive observers, they begin recognizing their own influence on the outcome. This level of self-awareness can be uncomfortable, but it can also be transformative. Because true growth rarely begins with comfort. Growth begins when a person becomes willing to face the truth. The truth that fear may have dictated their decisions. The truth that vulnerability felt dangerous. The truth that they pushed away things they secretly wanted. The truth that emotional walls protected them from pain, but also prevented deeper connection. As these realizations emerge, an emotional awakening often follows. For perhaps the first time, they begin understanding the cost of avoidance. They see how many opportunities were lost because fear was stronger than courage. They see how many meaningful moments slipped away because distance felt safer than intimacy. They see how much energy was spent protecting themselves from rejection, while simultaneously preventing genuine closeness. This awakening does not always lead to reconciliation. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does not. But the greater value lies in the lesson itself. Because awareness creates the possibility of change. A person cannot transform what they refuse to acknowledge. The avoidance emotional awakening begins when they finally stop running long enough to see themselves clearly. Meanwhile, the person who stopped caring continues moving forward. They are no longer waiting for someone else's realization. They are no longer depending on someone else's growth. They are building a stronger life, a healthier mindset, and a deeper relationship with themselves. And this is the great irony. The moment the avoidant begins recognizing your value is often the same moment you have begun recognizing your own. You are no longer seeking validation. You are no longer chasing approval. You are no longer trying to convince someone of your worth. You already know your worth. That confidence becomes a powerful force. Because while regret teaches the avoidant what they lost, self-respect teaches you what you should never lose again: your peace, your dignity, and your unwavering belief in your own value. In the end, reflection and regret are not punishments. They are teachers. They arrive when the noise disappears and the truth can finally be heard. And for many avoidants, that truth becomes the beginning of an emotional awakening they never may expected but desperately needed. One of the most profound shifts that occurs after you stop caring is something most people never anticipate. They assume the avoidance emotional struggle comes solely from losing the relationship. They believe the pain comes only from your absence. While that may be partially true, there is often something much deeper happening beneath the surface. The avoidant is not only reacting to the loss of your attention, they are reacting to the person you are becoming without them. For a long time, your focus may have been directed toward maintaining the connection. You invested energy trying to understand them, support them, reassure them, and keep the relationship alive. You spent countless hours wondering what they were thinking, why they were pulling away, and what you could do differently. In many cases, your personal growth was placed on hold. Your dreams were delayed. Your priorities were pushed aside. Your emotional energy was consumed by uncertainty. Then something changes. You stop chasing. You stop chasing. You stop measuring your worth through their responses. And for the first time in a long time, your energy returns to where it always belonged, to yourself. This is where real transformation begins. You start investing in your goals. You start focusing on your health. You start developing new skills. You start creating a life that excites you. You begin reconnecting with passions, ambitions, and possibilities that were neglected while you were emotionally occupied. Day by day, your confidence grows. Not because someone finally chose you, but because you finally chose yourself. That distinction is important. Many people spend years waiting for external validation to feel valuable. They believe confidence will arrive when someone loves them correctly, appreciates them fully, or commits to them completely. But genuine confidence is born from self-respect. It emerges when you stop abandoning your own needs. It grows when your actions align with your values. It strengthens every time you honor your own worth. As this transformation unfolds, something remarkable happens. The avoidant begins noticing, perhaps through social media, perhaps through mutual friends, perhaps through simple observation, or perhaps through intuition. They see that you are no longer standing still. They see that your life continues. They see that your happiness no longer depends on their presence. And suddenly, you become a mirror. Not a mirror that reflects their appearance. A mirror that reflects their choices. Your growth highlights the difference between movement and stagnation. Your confidence highlights their uncertainty. Your emotional maturity highlights their avoidance. Your willingness to face life boldly highlights the fears they have been trying to escape. This is why your transformation can feel so emotionally unsettling to them. Every time they see you thriving, they are reminded of what was possible. Every achievement reminds them of your strength. Every step forward reminds them that you did not collapse without them. Every sign of happiness challenges the belief that they were the center of your world. For someone who became accustomed to your pursuit, this realization can be deeply uncomfortable. Not because they want you to suffer, but because your growth forces them to confront a difficult truth. You were never the problem they imagined. You were never lacking value. You were never insufficient. The issue was not your worth. The issue was their inability to fully receive what was being offered. That realization can trigger intense reflection. They begin asking themselves difficult questions. Why couldn't I appreciate this when it was present? Why did I create distance from someone who genuinely cared? Why did I assume they would always remain available? Why am I noticing their value now? These questions can lead to a powerful emotional reckoning. Because growth has a unique effect on people. It exposes excuses. It removes illusions. It reveals reality. When you remain stuck, others can justify their own lack of progress. But when you rise, when you heal, when you evolve, you become living evidence that change is possible. And that evidence can be impossible to ignore. The most important lesson, however, is not about how your growth affects them. It is about how your growth transforms you. Your goal is not to become successful so someone regrets losing you. Your goal is not to become stronger so someone feels guilty. Your goal is not to create jealousy or prove a point. Those motivations are too small for the life you are meant to live. True transformation happens when your focus shifts completely away from proving something to another person. You grow because growth is your responsibility. You heal because peace is your birthright. You evolve because your future deserves the best version of you. And when you embrace that mindset, you become unstoppable. The avoidant may eventually recognize your value. They may reflect on what they lost. They may even wish they had chosen differently. But by then, the most important victory has already occurred. You have become the person you were always capable of becoming. And nothing is more powerful than a person who no longer needs external validation because they used to have discovered their worth within themselves. That transformation becomes your greatest success, and, at the same time, the mirror that reflects lessons others can no longer avoid seeing. At the heart of every painful relationship experience lies a lesson that has the power to transform an entire life. It is a lesson many people resist at first, because it requires them to let go of something they may have been chasing for far too long. That lesson is simple yet profound. Your worth cannot be determined by another person's ability or inability to recognize it. When people become emotionally attached to someone who is avoidant, they often fall into a dangerous trap without realizing it. They begin seeking validation from the very person who struggles to provide it. Every text message becomes a measure of value. Every conversation becomes proof of importance. Every moment of attention feels like confirmation that they matter. Over time, their emotional state becomes dependent upon another person's behavior. If the avoidant is warm, they feel hopeful. If the avoidant is distant, they feel anxious. If the avoidant reaches out, they feel valued. If the avoidant withdraws, they begin questioning themselves. Without realizing it, they have handed over control of their self-worth. This is where suffering begins. Because the moment your confidence depends on someone else's approval, your emotional stability becomes fragile. You start living on an emotional roller coaster. Your happiness rises and falls according to circumstances you cannot control. You become trapped in a cycle of seeking reassurance, seeking answers, seeking validation. seeking proof that you are enough. But here is one of the most important truths a person can ever learn. No amount of external validation can permanently fill a void that exists within. Even if the avoidance suddenly changed, even if they became more affectionate, even if they committed completely, even if they gave you every word you wanted to hear, the deeper issue would remain unresolved until you learn to validate yourself. Because self-worth is not something another person gives you. It is something you recognize within yourself. The journey toward this realization is often painful. It usually begins with disappointment. A relationship does not unfold the way you hoped. The effort is not returned equally. The connection feels uncertain. The future becomes unclear, and eventually you reach a crossroads. You can continue chasing validation, or you can begin reclaiming your power. This is the moment that changes everything. The moment you stop asking, "Why don't they see my value?" and start asking, "Why have I been ignoring my own value?" That question opens a new chapter. You begin recognizing qualities that have always existed within you. Your loyalty, your compassion, your resilience, your kindness, your determination, your capacity to love deeply. You stop viewing these traits as weaknesses. You start recognizing them as strengths. You realize that someone else's inability to appreciate them does not diminish their worth. A diamond remains valuable even if someone mistakes it for a stone. Its value never changes. Only the observer's perception changes. The same is true for you. The avoidance recognition is not what makes you worthy. You were worthy long before they arrived. You remain worthy whether they stay or leave. You remain worthy whether they understand your value or not. This realization creates a level of freedom that many people spend years searching for. Suddenly, you are no longer desperate for answers. You are no longer obsessed with outcomes. You are no longer waiting for someone to choose you, because you have already chosen yourself. And when you choose yourself, your standards begin to rise. You stop accepting inconsistent effort. You stop tolerating emotional neglect. You stop making excuses for behavior that continually hurts you. Not because you have become bitter, but because you have become aware of your value, aware of your needs, aware of what healthy love truly requires. The irony is that this self-respect often creates the very energy people were seeking all along. Confidence becomes natural. Peace becomes consistent. Emotional strength becomes genuine. Not because someone finally validated you, but because you stopped requiring validation to feel complete. This is the ultimate lesson hidden within the experience of loving an avoidant person. The greatest victory is not making them regret losing you. The greatest victory is learning that your happiness does not depend on their regret. The greatest victory is not hearing them finally say, "I realize your worth." The greatest victory is reaching a place where you no longer need to hear those words. Because you already know them. You know your worth. You know your value. You know your purpose. And once that knowledge becomes part of your identity, no rejection can destroy it. No silence can weaken it. And no person's inability to appreciate you can take it away. That is true freedom. That is emotional power. That is the moment you stop chasing validation and start living from a place of certainty, self-respect, and unshakable confidence. And from that place, every area of your life begins to transform, because you are no longer seeking permission to be valuable. You finally understand that you always were.